Alright then, so. It's story time! It's story time! I'm not sure I'm gonna make this episode 4 or episode 3.5 yet, but you know. Well, this is specifically why I'm basically like doing this recording. It's like, reading this lore, so. Not sure yet. Probably gonna make it episode 3.5 though. Just because some people may not be like, interested in like the lore, but whatever. I am. Oh yeah. It's very different when you don't actually have Steam like, starting by itself. You have to actually like, manually wait for it. But whatever. Still pretty quick. Load game. And here we go. Now, I had a stray thought, by the way, while I was basically like, thinking about my story basically in the background here. So we note that basically chapters 2 and 3, or books 2 and 3 rather, are basically in like, Ziggurar. Well, like book 1 here is basically in like, Elvia, as well as like book 4. But there's actually 5 books, so I'm actually wondering where the 5th books are going to be, like, chapters and such. Because as you basically see here, there's only like, books like, 1 and 4 here in like Elvia, so. Where's book 5, I wonder? Because there's a book 5, by the way. I'm not wondering if it's basically in the game or if this is like, available elsewhere. So by 1, Escapades of Fay Willows, book 1, chapter 1, Devastation of the Spellblaze. So yes, we're gonna buy this. So yes, here we go. I remember the devastation when I first made my journey to Elvia. Not a soul escaped to touch the Spellblaze, and no one could feel the pain and sorrow of the lands more than thalore. I know that those back home still seethe with rage and anger, as even now, I still sometimes feel my emotions from that moment. It was a terrible day. I wish I could forget, but never will. I'll note that basically for each of these chapters I have sort of like italicized like sort of text at the top that basically like it's sort of like separate from the story but like related to it, but whatever. Alright, so if I were to describe my years growing up in my birthplace, it would be summed up pretty easily as boring, uneventful, and repetitive. I grew up in forests that no longer exist, collecting wood from fallen and dead trees while planting and cultivating new trees to grow. The wood I collected was stored in a large stockpile behind my house and used to fashion staves or bows by other skilled thaloren who lived nearby for sale abroad. The proceeds from our exports were used to buy items we couldn't really find in our forest or in the lands of the humans or halflings nearby. That all changed one day when the skies changed to a color of deep purple, and above me the tops of all the trees I tended began to burst into a cacophony of sickling colors. Below me the earth began to shake to its very foundation, and the ground I stood on tore apart, causing trees to uproot and come crashing down. Perhaps worst of all, though, was the air that howled around me, a spraying dark wind that swept through the trees in a wave of sickness that perverted the lands and caused everything to decay. By sheer luck, I somehow survived the devastation. I'm not entirely sure how, but many of my fellow thaloren who were with me did not. Gone was the home which I lived in, and the wood that I collected. Gone were the trees that I planted, or had stood for generations before. All that was left around me was a dead husk of trees and the ruined settlements I grew up in, as well as some of the rotting and misshapen corpses of those I once knew. I joined together with those that survived to rescue who we could, but many succumbed to their injuries, both before and after we found them. It was when we began to bury the corpses that I remember hearing the cries of anguish for the loss of loved ones, not to mention the destruction of nature all around us. Eventually soldiers came for us, and we were led towards the capital for shelter from the polluted lands that was once our home. Reaching the city, I was greeted by a truly chaotic display as refugees streamed in from other settlements. The wounded lined the streets, and seemingly everyone else was in open hysteria. I was a bit perplexed at first, wondering why the wounded were being being tended to, or the refugees being housed. It wasn't long before I learned that the reason for the maddening sounds spewing from their lungs, and this catastrophe being the result of Shaloran mages. I can still feel the tense, unthinking rage I felt, even now, as I recall it. It was at that point I decided that I would visit the Shaloran lands. I felt at that time that I had made the decision of my own volition, to enact retribution against the Shaloran. Though now, I don't know if that was truly the cause. Regardless of my reasoning, I made my way back to my home to collect whatever I could find in the rubble, and the next day I left the horrors of the forests. For the next several days, I crossed through blackened and blasted lands, finding little to eat or drink. Travel was slow, as a result of the debris being scattered across the land, not to mention the difficulty it took scavenging for food. I was starving when I spotted a small settlement that had escaped the destruction. I entered the first inn I came across and quickly purchased some food. As I consumed my meal, I overheard a couple of patrons arguing about the recent events. A human voice yelled, "Even the orcs couldn't have brought this sort of devastation." Turning my head to listen, I soon heard a half retort. "You say that, but the orcs could have soon reached these lands, and you would be too dead to care." "Yeah, well now thanks to those accursed mages, and a manageable number of people are dead. Dead! The orcs killed more, and they left no one alive. You at least still have some friends and loved ones who survived. All those who I once knew are dead. Dead!" Silence permeated the air between the two. I could feel the rage within the human, much like I could feel my own, but he soon got up and left. I wish I could say that I had done the same, but unfortunately I cannot. When the halfling proceeded to begin gathering his belongings and leave, I followed him out of the establishment. Seemingly aware of this, I was confronted outside. Heated words were exchanged between us, then shouting. I don't entirely recall as to what happened next, but I do remember looking at my bloody hand as the halfling lay dead on the ground. Becoming aware of what I had done, I quickly fled from the settlement. Over the next 2 days, I didn't eat or sleep. I crossed through several now dead settlements, seemingly abandoned by whoever survived. I couldn't stop thinking about the halfling that I had killed, and though the Shaloran still remained the focus of my anger, I began to question what I was doing. I soon had more questions to think about as I came upon a recent battlefield. Charred corpses of what I assumed to be orcs lay scattered on the ground, and there were innumerable amounts of them. Across from the corpses I soon saw the corpses of Shaloran soldiers, and this puzzled me greatly. What anger I had felt toward the Shaloran now turned to confusion. By what madness were they dead? Were they sacrificed to kill the orcs? Did they willingly do it of their own accord? Were the Shaloran really to blame? I couldn't find an answer to any of the questions racing through my mind, as I wondered what I should do. Eventually, I continued onward, and found the outskirts of a Shaloran settlement. Through the collapsed buildings, I could see wolves feasting on the remains of corpses, which I assumed to be the residents. I also heard a voice cry for help in the distance. Making my way towards where the voice was coming from, I saw a male Shaloran surrounded by a group of hungry wolves. A couple of the wolves looked in my direction, and swiftly made their way toward me. Having dealt with rogue animals in the past, I quickly dodged as the first one lunged towards me and struck a blow against it, causing it to stumble back a bit. The second one came around to attack me from the side, clamping down my left arm. With a firm thrust, I slammed it against the ruined side of a building, causing it to give a big yelp and let go. Realizing I was not to be trifled with, the wolves scampered off quickly. Giving notice to the 2 wolves fleeing, the other wolves soon turned tail as well. I sat down to examine the injury I had received. Despite what looked to be a fairly painful wound, I remember feeling little to no pain from it. I soon pulled out an infusion that I had brought with me, and began to treat the gash left from the creature's teeth. While doing this, I heard a voice call out from behind me. Realizing the Shaloran was still here, I turned around as he approached. As he drew closer and looked towards my face, the Shalor immediately stopped and gave a blank face. A bit perplexed by this, I sat there looking confused. For a moment, we stared at each other in silence before Shalor finally exclaimed, "You're thalore." I blinked a couple of times at this before I replied yes. Seemingly in shock for a brief moment before finally coming to his senses, I was soon asked what I was doing here. Upon hearing that question, I wondered what I should answer. I didn't realize I no longer knew the answer to why I had come here, and the anger that had driven me had come and mostly dissipated. After a while, I finally gave an answer. I've come to find out why. Alright, so, that's basically the first, chapter of, the first book there. And I think before we, continue on, let's just, lower the audio options a little bit, so, music's not so high here, so... Did I do it? No, I did not. There we go, that'll work. Alright, so, I'll note that basically these, these, bits of lore basically I wrote for the game here, Escapades of Fay Willows. I'll note that, I basically, wrote this because there wasn't a whole lot of, lore at the time for, the thalore, and I'm not really sure there really is any, yet, because I've yet to play the game, really. But, basically, there wasn't a whole lot of lore for, the thalore, or, in regards to, the Spellblaze. And, I wanted to basically, contribute something to the game to, sort of, fix that problem, so I wrote up, basically, the Escapades of Fay Willows. I'm noting in hindsight, I expect it to be, a fairly long, piece, similar to, the Spellblaze Chronicles, but I never imagined I'd make it, probably as long as it basically did, because I think it's even longer than the Spellblaze Chronicles, but, I think it turned out pretty well for a story, and, I think, most people have, probably enjoyed who basically wrote it. I never actually really got, a lot of, criticism back at least, so... Well, they probably never knew it was not me who wrote it, but whatever. Alright, so... Let's go to, Chapter 2, Infusion Avoidance, I guess. I've never really understood why people so rarely gave their names. Among the Shaloran, I scarcely knew the names of anyone, save for that of family or those considered as such. I remember a dwarf merchant that once visited my home place. He seemed to think that whatever title he held meant something. Really, names mean nothing. I could deal with a human or halfling merchant the same as that dwarf. I don't need to know your name to deal with you. I should probably note, by the way, these little bits of Catalytic script, by the way, are actually very they're basically little attempts by me to actually add a little bit more lore basically into the game, because a lot of the story itself, you're basically getting a glimpse of the thought process of Floryn, so hopefully I sort of define the Floryn a little bit better, because I don't think they're very well defined before, and hopefully now they're a little bit better defined, but whatever. Alright, so let's just keep going on. So, for another brief moment, there was silence. In his mind, he seemed to mull over the meaning of what he said. Well, whatever. That should be what I said, but whatever. But seemingly understood what I was after. As he took a moment to think, as I glanced him over. Both the Shalor's face and clothing was quite rugged, and I noticed a quiver along with a dagger at his side. I would have figured him for a hunter, but the way he spoke seemed to be too disciplined for it. He probably was of a military background, most likely a scout for a Shaloran military. I also noticed the blood streaming down his arm from an untreated wound. "You should treat that," I stated. Glancing toward his arm, the man merely grunted. "I'll bandage it soon enough." Why he said bandaged it confused me, but before I had time to ask about it, he soon stated, "Come, it's dangerous here with the animals." Moving past me, he proceeded to begin walking southwards. I was motioned to follow, and hearing a wolf's howl in the distance, I decided it would probably be best to do so. We made our way out and away from the buildings. While a couple of animals caught notice of us, they simply just watched us as we made our way out of the settlement. For a couple of hours, we walked down a wooded road. Along the way, the man introduced himself. He gave his name, as the other races seemed to commonly do, and stated he was a ranger that had been dispatched to find any Shaloran that had left outside the walls of the capital city. Unfortunately, while gathering people to leave, the ghouls attacked and killed everyone in the settlement, where I had encountered him. He lost his bow when I had come along, and was the only one still alive. The rest of the Shaloran he had come to rescue were eaten by wolves. Somberly we continued onward from that point in silence. It was another hour before we walked towards an active campsite ahead. As we approached, a couple of cloaked figures stepped out from behind us. With swords in hand, a few more approached us from in front. They seemed to pause and look in my direction for a moment. A final figure soon stepped forwards, another Shaloran man, and seemingly the leader of the group. Hoarsely, the leader stated, "Where are the residents?" "Dead. Food for the wolves," the scout replied. Same would have been for me. The leader soon glanced in my direction before stating, "I'm guessing this one is involved in you coming back then. Come, let's go back on talking to camp." The leader turned to walk away. Once again the scout motioned for me to follow, and we made our way towards a simmering fire. A ragged bunch of Shaloran sat around it, while Shalor, in a heavy cloak like the other men, stood guard with a bow in hand. Nearby, a couple more Shaloran lay in what looked to be a hastily constructed lean-to. Red stains dyed bandages covering injuries on their bodies. The leader walked over to a chest nearby, pulling out a bow and some fresh bandages, handed them to the scout. The look of confusion soon crossed my face again, of which the leader seemed to catch notice. The leader asked, "Something wrong, thalore?" Silently, I finally got some answers as to why they weren't using infusions. I soon responded, "What's with the bandages? Do you not have any infusions?" Seemingly amused by this, the leader retorted, "A Shalor used infusions." The leader seemed to smile, as if some joke had been told. I could hear some of the cloaked figures chuckling in the background. Proceeding to talk, the leader continued, "While I understand that he might make use of infusions, we seek to strive above such things by our nature." I was a bit baffled by this response. Hearing a cough from one of the nearby wounded Shalor, though, I politely stayed, "Even if you might die as a result of not using them." To this, the leader's face took a more solemn look as he looked towards the Shaloran under the lean-to. Looking back toward me, the leader quickly responded, "Of course not." As I looked toward the Shalor, I directly stated in a firm voice, "Then why are those Shaloran laying wounded there?" To this, the response was quietly given, "Because the Shalor does not carry infusions with them." How stupid, I thought. I heard of the halflings being proud, but even they weren't this foolhardy. Reaching into my pack, I pulled out some infusions and held them out in my hand. Seemingly to all the Shaloran looked down with some contempt at the infusions in my hand, but they said nothing. Finally, from behind, the scout stated, "Enough have died. With their wounds, those two might outlive the night." Immediately I could see the discomfort across the leader's face, but he merely closed his eyes and stated, "If you wish to treat them, thalore, do as you will." I was awestruck at this indifferent tone, but I held my tongue as I heard more coughing from the wounded Shalor. Deciding what's best for now would be to treat the wounds Shaloran. I simply walked over to the lean-to. In no time at all, I removed the bandages and began treating their wounds. Quickly the gaps in their skin closed and their bodies began to mend as I used my infusions. While not fully healed as my infusions were used up, the two I treated looked far better off than they were before. Reaching into my pack to pull out some more infusions to finish the job, I heard the leader's voice call out, "That's enough." Snapping my head back in amazement, I held my tongue, no longer saying, "Did you not wish for me to treat them?" Diplomatically I received a reply. "They don't look like they are going to die anymore now, do they? Those infusions you have, they are a finite resource. Maybe you should save them for those who are nearer to death." Calming down a bit, I wondered what the Shalor was getting at, so I asked the questions. "What do you mean, save them for who?" Alright, so, this is probably the first, real chapter, that really, sort of, puts a spin on, why I say the Shaloran don't, start with, any, infusions at the start of a game, or, a little bit, basically, a background of, the distinct, personalities of, say, the halflings, or, the Shaloran and stuff like that, because, this game is, it's pretty good about, establishing, what each of the factions are basically like, but, I never really felt there's really good proper reasoning as to why the Shaloran don't actually have any infusions at the start of a game, or what makes the halflings proud, for example. But whatever. I thought this would be a good chapter to sort of get that in there. So that's basically what this chapter here is all about, basically. All right, let's go to the third chapter. By the way, I'm only gonna read through these first 6 chapters here. I'm not gonna, if I had the money, I'd buy for book 2, but we don't have that just yet, so We'll keep it simple. While the Shaloran are no longer as lost as they seemingly were when I first entered Elvia, I can still see the searching expressions on their faces even now as I write this. It is as if they would feel similar loss to whatever it is they are connected to, in the same way the thalore feel this devastation of nature. I do not know what connection to the arcane nature have, but I know it is shared relationship, and strain on one will result in strain on the other. I probably should have been like, you know, what connection the arcane nature have. Well, I guess that's right. Well, whatever. Let's just keep going here. So, basically, like, this is like sort of establishing that, like, you know, nature and arcane are basically entwined. They're not really, like, you know, that distinct and stuff, but whatever. Alright, so, aware of the suffering of the other Shaloran, it was soon explained to me that there were other groups of rangers relocating refugees from the other settlements to the capital. I can't say I had any interest in helping the other Shaloran, and personally felt that I was simply being dissuaded from using my infusions any more than I had to on the casualties I had just treated. However, the scout being aware of my intentions helped to broker a deal. If I helped the rangers in their duties of rescuing as many Shaloran as possible, they would help me get the answers I sought. To these terms I agreed, and over the next couple of days I traveled with the rangers as they rounded up what people they could. On the third day we began to journey towards the south, through a dense forest. As we cleared the forest boundaries, a natural misty smoke swirled in the distance. I was told that beyond the smoke lay Elvia, which I would come to learn was the name of their capital. Traveling for a couple minutes, we came to a spot near a small lake. All at once the tunnel opened up, seemingly uninviting us inside. It was terribly disorienting within this tunnel. The sounds of dust and wind seemed to scream a terrible discord. I think I also saw the corpses of humans deep within the smoke for some reason as we made our way towards the other side. As the city came into view, I was soon greeted by a bleak view. As I walked through the streets with the rangers, all I could see was the blank expressions on the other Shaloran faces. Seemingly they all wandered here and there as if in some sort of haze. A strange sense of panic seemed to course through every Shalor that I passed, as if they had lost something dear to them. Having come here initially to seek retribution on him, I wondered if I would still do so after seeing the people here like this. The Shaloran were a broken people, and while those responsible had committed a vile atrocity against Maj'Eyal, those I saw here seemingly endured a harsh punishment in response. I could still feel deep anger at the time, but them living as they did now seemed to be a satisfactory punishment, and any hostile feelings I felt towards them was almost mollified. They seemingly paid for their crime in full. The refugees we had brought were soon escorted to an open lot in the center of the city, where hastily constructed tents had been set up. Some refugees appeared to be in mourning, while others seemingly attempted to remain a hold of their sanity. As the last of the refugees left us, a Shaloran in white robes approached us. From within his robes I caught eye of some infusions. Finally, I thought, a Shalor of common sense enough to carry some infusions. We were soon asked if there were any injured among us, to which the leader of the rangers shook his head. Somewhat disapproving of this, the healer pressed for answers. A hand was waved in my direction. The healer quickly glanced towards me, blinking for a moment. The healer gave the same dumbfounded expressions that the scout had given me before. "Yes, I'm a thalore," I sternly stated. "Oh, yes." The healer started back. As the healer regained his senses, the ranger took the healer's ear and whispered to it. The eyes seemed to raise on the healer for a moment, before a quick yes seemed to part his lips. Thalore, would you follow me then, please?" As the healer began to walk away, I looked to the leader of the rangers one more time. Looking back to me, he replied, "The doctor will take you to the main healing grounds. Don't worry, I haven't forgot our bargain with you. I will try to get your audience with someone who can give you the answers you seek." I got the sense that he was looking to milk my services for all he could at this point, and coldly replied back, "You best not test my patience too long." Seemingly smiling to this, he nodded towards the waiting healer, and slowly began to head off. We soon head over to a muddy field, dodging the tents of refugees that had been raised everywhere. Eventually we came to a tall building, inside of which many Shaloran lay wounded on beds, and some too on the floor. Making our way to the back of the building, we enter what I assumed to be the healer's office. You wouldn't happen to know the basis of mixing infusions, would you? I was soon asked. I know how to mix basic numbing and regenerative infusions, I replied. Nodding to this, the healer pulled out a paper and began to write down on it. As the healer finished writing, he handed the paper to me. The Shalore and thalore are near identical in biology when it comes to infusions, so anything that you could use on yourself will work on a Shalore. Here's a list of infusion ingredients we have available. I'll lead you to our workshop where you can get to work making some. The healer rose to get up, grabbing a key from the shelf. Moving towards the door, I was led to the basement where the infusion's workshop was. Unlocking the door, the healer handed me a key and let me inside. Alright, now, I should probably note by the way that, like, this, like, chapters here, the past chapter is basically, like, establishing sort of like the personalities of the races, but, this sort of like, was like sort of like building on the lore of, like, other, like, bits in the game. So, for those who basically read, like, the Spellblaze Chronicles already, I'll note that basically in it they, like, state, like, how, like, humans basically came to attack the capital of, like, Elvia, and essentially, like, because of that, the Shaloran, like, put up the, like, smoky wall to, like, conceal themselves and, like, keep the outside world basically at bay. Basically, this is, like, sort of like building on that, because, like, it's basically, like, saying that this is, like, sort of like after the events where, like, the Shalore were, like, set upon by humans and stuff like that, the angry mobs that basically come for them. But, whatever. Basically, the idea here is, like, this chapter is basically, it's sort of like building on, like, the other lore here, but also, like, sort of like, establishing a little bit about, like, basically what's basically sort of happening, like, in the events, basically after, like, the initial, like, Spellblaze Chronicles stuff, basically. So, yeah. Just to throw it out, this, like, sort of a continuation of, like, I guess Gray's, like, piece over here, the Spellblaze Chronicles. Alright, so, that's chapter 3 basically done. And now I'm going to basically take a drink of water because, well, let's just put it this way. I'm reading through a lot here, so give me a moment. I am speaking a lot. Alright, that's better. But yeah, I'll note that basically, like, over here you have, like, change Maj'Eyal into the Darkness and Forbidden. Basically the stuff that, like, I guess, like, Gray basically wrote. Basically detailing, like, the events of, like, the Chronicles and, like, a little bit basically after. This sort of, like, builds basically even past that, so, maybe, like, the first, like, couple books basically there, they may, like, happen, like, just, like, just in, like, at the end of, like, the Spellblaze Chronicles, but, now we're basically getting to, like, the points basically right after it, so we're continuing on a story, so to speak. Alright, so, it still strikes me how averse the Shaloran are to infusions. Seemingly they would rather tempt fate and avoid using them. One of the purposes of infusions is to restore one to good health after suffering an injury, but for a Shalore, it was more a means of a last resort to avoid dying. What's more, they seem to fail to understand that holding off an infusion use simply results in them using infusions more in the long run, as beyond just mending their flesh, they will have to stay off infection from their open wounds as well. I'll note that the idea here, by the way, for those basically who, like, play this game, they probably understand that, like, a lot of the, like, the detrimental elements in this game, like, there's sometimes, like, it can be, like, secondary effect that basically happens, like, basically, like, this proccing off it, so, for basically, like, those who recall, like, the last episode where I basically had, like, hurricane basically happening to me, where, like, the air elemental basically hit me for, like, days, but, because, like, they have the special ability that, like, causes days targets to get, like, hurricane on them, I'm basically taking extra damage after it, so, this basically sort of builds onto that sort of idea, so that's basically what this is all about. Alright, so, over the next few days, I mixed and created several infusions for use by the Shaloran. The workshop contained all the amenities for sleeping, and the healer would often bring basic food staples and drink to me. Well, I should say to Shalore it may have been basic food and drink, but by Floran standards, I was treated pretty lavishly. I mean, I know the dwarves treat alcohol as a staple good for consumption, but apparently so did the Shaloran with the amounts of wine I was given. Anyhow, how I was treated was quite better than I would have expected, to be sure. Around the 4th day, after having created a great number of infusions, I was asked to come up to help apply them. Many of those I treated were near death, riddled by festering infections brought about from simply bandaging their wounds and nothing else. Similar to how I treated the wounded Shalore in the lean-to, I only used the infusions as much as possible to get them off of death's door. This wasn't really due to having a lack of infusions, but more a result of a stubborn mindset Shaloran seemed to have in regards to infusions for some reason. It was about a week later, when most of the refugees had been treated, that word had arrived with a detachment of Shaloran's soldiers that had returned from their battles with the orcs. Apparently they had been fighting on the eastern side of the continent, along with the human kingdoms of the east, when the Spellblaze occurred. The scarce few that were still alive after had traveled back to Elvia, but had been stalled as a result of being unable to travel directly through the middle of the continent. Of those that had survived, only a couple of hundred had managed to make it back alive. By this point, I had at least some sympathy for those I treated, what after having tended to hundreds of them. But what caught my attention more was what they had said about being unable to travel directly to Elvia. In the middle of the continent, the Midvale Plains were located, a large flat land from which one literally could see just an open field. From my basic knowledge of the continent, the plains were completely open and easily traversable. Unless there was some huge orcish army that had survived and blocked their path, there would have been no need to move northwards around this area. I didn't have long to ponder my thoughts before one of the assistant healers approached and handed a bunch of strange tablets in a leather pouch to me. Pulling one of them out, I noticed a glowing insignia inscribed on it, which seemed to course with the powers of the arcane. As I turned to ask what these were for, I found only an empty space in the healer, space as the healer moved on to tend to soldiers that were entering the building. Perplexity felt as to what I should do with the strange tablets. A nearby tap on his shoulder brought my attention to one of the soldiers. A hand soon reached over and took one of the strange tablets from the pouch. Turning to see what the soldier was up to, I noticed the huge gashes through the blackened armor he wore. For a moment I started a bit as my hands were full holding the runes and unable to grab any infusions, but then I noticed something peculiar. Amazingly, the insignia on the tablet seemed to shimmer and shift before somehow merging with the soldier's hand. A light blue glow seemed to take hold on the soldier's eyes as a strange energy seemingly coursed through their body. What occurred next truly caught me off guard, as the soldier eventually began to murmur some words, and his deep gaping wounds began to close on their own. Completely at a loss for what was occurring, the soldier seemed to be healing himself in front of me. As the moment passed, the light began to glow. Light blue glow left his eyes, and then returned to their normal color. His wounds not just healed, but showing absolutely no sign of injury, even having existed. It is my first time ever witnessing the use of runes, or the use of healing spells. I'd heard of spell use before, but I'd never known that runes had existed at this point in my life. I soon learned that tablets I had been given were called mana surge runes, and that they enabled the restoration of mana lines within a person. I don't know much about the arcane, even now, or how it works, but apparently something about the Spellblaze had permanently altered the workings and magic from that point in the world. And while with training it was still possible to call on the powers of magic, it was much more difficult than before. Other wounded soldiers would come after first, and much in the same way, they would take a mana surge runes, gain the glowing insignias on their hands, or arms, or legs, really any body part they wished, and then proceed to cast spells, promptly healing themselves or something, sometimes other soldiers. After a while, the number of wounded soldiers began to dwindle, as most of them didn't require rest after healing themselves. When the numbers began to reach more manageable amounts, the chief healer approached to thank me on behalf of Shaloran for my efforts. Suddenly, remembering the entire reason I had come here to begin with, I noted that I had been fulfilling my end of the bargain. Nodding to this, the chief healer looked behind me as a soldier approached and responded. The lieutenant will escort you to the general. I was taken aback by this somewhat, but assumed this general had answers as to the events that had taken place. The soldier led me to the center of the city, where a grand building lay. After meeting with a couple of the guards clad head to toe in shiny plate armor, we were let in. It took several minutes walking through the building's halls, seemingly walking the building's entire length to the end of it. Eventually I came to a luxurious looking room. Decorations made of starlight and gold lined the walls and displaying pictures of what I assumed to be important figures in Shaloran history. Here I was told to wait, and left by the lieutenant as they entered a nearby room. Alright, so chapter 4 sort of like, continues on a little bit because it's a little bit different from like the past chapters that basically we're like sort of building on lore because I'm not basically in Tales of Maj'Eyal with the Spellblaze there's really like no lore basically as to like what basically sort of like, you know, the Spellblaze actually did to the lands. And like, you know, you basically see like the after effects of it, but you know, you never actually really learn like what exactly the Spellblaze actually did to it. So something I actually wanted to do like here was actually sort of like create sort of like this like sort of like, you know, idea that like, you know, maybe the Spellblaze had like done like a lot more than like, you know, just like, you know, a cursed lands like, you know, and like Stardom, so to speak. But you know, it actually like, you know, maybe like, you know, got rid of like, you know, well, let's just put it away. The medieval like planes that basically I mentioned up here in like the top of like the, you know, the thing here. Basically, the idea here, like, you know, is basically like, you know, the continent maybe looked a lot different than it would be like, you know, in like the current like gameplay as of right now. So if you basically like, you know, look outside like, you know, on the world map here, I was like, you know, go here for a moment. Basically over here on like, you know, the map. I completely forgot how to basically use the map. I was like, you know, walk around this way, I guess. So I'll note that basically for those like, you know, who recall, basically there's like these mountains basically over here in like, you know, the middle of the map over here. But basically the idea of like, you know, what basically is written here, maybe it's like all used to be like, you know, a complete plain that you could basically like, you know, walk across. So there wasn't like, you know, any like, you know, mountains basically here, or perhaps like no like lake over here. So basically just like all like, you know, terrain features that basically occurred as a result of the Spellblaze, not really like, you know, naturally they've been there before. And that's basically like, you know, the idea that I was basically going for, basically. Like, you know, these mountains here, they were like not naturally created, they're like actually unnatural mountains over here. So, that's what this is like basically all about. These are like unnatural mountains basically. And I'll note by the way as well, like, you know, when I basically was talking about the Monastery's ruins, basically like, you know, this is sort of like, you know, giving like sort of a description of like, you know, when they basically sort of came into use, because prior to like, you know, basically like, you know, the Spellblaze, I assume basically all the Shalore could like, you know, magically they do whatever they want to with magic for the most part, but you know, after basically like the events, it became a lot harder for them to basically charge their magic, so they actually need like, you know, help from like mana surge runes and stuff like that to like, you know, basically charge their spells and such. And only like the most gifted of them can basically draw magic, so that's basically something as well. Alright, so by the way, I should probably like note by the way that like, you know, with like, you know, perfect precise strikes here, I'm probably gonna actually turn this like sustain on at some point, so I'll probably start leveling up this like skill for like, you know, future use, just to throw out there. Alright, so I'm sort of getting sidetracked here, but let's just like keep reading on like the, you know, the story here. I'll stick in our swig of water, so bear with me a moment. It's important to drink your water, you know, so drink your water. But whatever. Let's keep going on. So, chapter 5, and here we get to like, you know, General Iranian, who is basically like, you know, one of like, you know, he's basically like the protagonist basically of like, you know, the Spellblaze Chronicles. So now we get to talk to him. So this is like my first use of like one of the main characters basically in the game who actually like exists. So hooray for that. General Iranian Goel, leader of the Grand Council of Elvia. This was perhaps the first name I ever learned from someone outside my family. While Iranian never gave his name to me personally, the rest of the Shaloran certainly bantered around enough to the point that I eventually remembered it. While perhaps there is little to acknowledge from one who is rarely given their names, I can perhaps respect Iranian, whose name I learned from those around him, and the idolization and fondness that they seem to speak it with. So yeah, basically like, you know, she like learns her like this guy's you know, Iranian's name basically just from the fact that like, you know, all the Shaloran speak of him like, you know, so highly, so tells you something. Before long, the solar reappeared, and I was ushered into a much more plain room. A desk sat in the middle of the room, and a row of windows that viewed the forest to the north behind it. On the side of the room sat what appeared to be an impressive display of armor, and a fierce-looking weapon laying in the center. Making my way into the office, I saw who I assumed to be the general, viewing some papers near a table in the corner of the room. He seemed to exude an aura of brilliance that made the other Shaloran look dull, though I could sense a weight of something seemingly hang around him. With a solemn discerning stare, he looked me up and down before directing me to a seat next to the desk in the middle of the room. Nodding in the direction of the lieutenant, the soldier who had escorted me quietly left the room, closing the door and leaving us alone. As directed, I proceeded to sit down, while the man took a seat in another chair on the other side. Almost immediately, as he sat down, he began to speak. From what I have been told by doctors, and from reports given to me by the rangers, you have spent several days helping to tend to many wounded Shaloran, and for this I thank you. Before I could say anything, the Shaloran seemingly began to talk again. I have to say, I was in a bit of disbelief when I was informed of you. A couple of my advisors offered to meet with you, but I had to see for myself that there was actually a thalore here. To my knowledge, a rare few of you thalore have stepped foot outside your forest in the last 4 millennia. You might be the only thalore I met in my lifetime, you see, and I wouldn't pass up the chance to meet you, one of you thalore in person. The Shaloran seemed to smile after saying this, though I was becoming very annoyed. If there was a reason for me coming here, getting gawked at wasn't it. Taking a breath before continuing to speak again, the general continued. Before continuing with this discussion, however, I feel the need to ask why. What would compel you to leave your forest and make the trip down to Shaloran lands? His questions caused me a pause in a moment. Any bloodlust that had felt upon initial devastation in Spellblaze had since left me. Really, I had no reason anymore for having come down here. After a moment, I replied in a harsh tone. Do I need to give any reason? The rather straightforward response seemingly got me a quick smirk. Slyly he stated, well, I imagined that if a thalore would have any reason to leave the forest of yours and come down here, it would been to exact a bloody massacre on any thalore that they would come across. I guess I was read like an open book at that moment, seeing right through from my exterior to my internal thoughts. I shrank back down a bit at this point, seemingly confirming to the general my inner thoughts. To this he seemed to relax a bit before saying, obviously something changed your mind since you haven't killed any Shaloran that I'm aware of. And in fact, you've been a great help to my people. For that, I will tell you what I know. Eventually, the Shaloran proceeded to tell me of the events that had transpired leading to this point. I learned that the calamity reached upon the land was named the Spellblaze, and that it had been unleashed in the hopes of defeating the orcs, who, up to this point, had been sweeping across the land. While the Shaloran had the best of intentions, the mages in charge had lost control of the vast energies they had tried to command, and torched both the orcs and themselves and the whole Maj'Eyal in the wave of destructive energy. Devastation of all kinds swept across the continent, some perhaps not even of our world. Quietly I listened as I was told all of this until everything was relayed to me. As he finished telling me the story of the Spellblaze, I was of mixed feelings as to how to judge the action of the Shaloran. On one hand, the Spellblaze had been released across the lands, leaving scars on it that would never heal. But I understood that they had acted to stop what he believed to be an unprecedented threat. As a result of their actions too, I knew that all the Shaloran were now suffering, and I had already decided that that was punishment enough for them. The discovery within my mind was obviously made clear across the desk, but the general refrained from saying anything, perhaps out of some underlying guilt for his part in the Spellblaze, or just due to being unable to say anything that could aid in my aligning my thoughts. For a time we sat in silence, though before long he soon got up and headed toward the window. His back turned, I could see his expression, but I could tell he thought heavily in regards to how events had unfolded. Arain, if you're reading this now, know that at least I've forgiven you. Now, I'm not basically like, this is sort of like, you know, my attempt basically to like, sort of like, you know, connect basically like, you know, basically Arain to like this lore, but also like, you know, sort of like, you know, displays like, you know, sort of like his afterthoughts as to like what basically sort of happened. But essentially like, you know, this like, you know, also like, you know, talks a little bit about the flora as well because there basically isn't really any like, you know, real like, you know, lore basically found about the flora basically in like, you know, Chatur. But basically here, like, you know, I basically give it like a little bit of like, you know, a little bit more like, you know, descriptions of what the flora basically like, being like, you know, very like, you know, apt to not leave their forests and like, you know, basically like stay where they basically are, so to speak. And yeah, basically like, you know, a little bit of like, you know, childless basically on the part of like the general being like, you know, ooh, there's a floor, I want to meet that because I never get a chance before, you know. Alright, so we're up to the final book here. After we read this book, that'll be like it for like this episode, but you know, whatever. At the time, I thought Iranian to be quite paranoid, but his ability to perceive the thoughts of the others and the activities taking place in the world can be described as naturally accurate. While the groups that instigate the spell hunt remains unknown while I write this, they were out there, and I would witness their activities firsthand. After a time, the Shalor finally asked, "What are you planning to do now?" Good question, I thought. "I haven't really thought of that yet," I replied. Though his back was still turned, I could feel that smirk through the back of his head. Turning towards me, he seemingly asked, "I suppose that you were likely to be heading back to your forest, but perhaps on the way you could do something to help the Shaloran out. Would you be interested in running some aid supplies for us? Looks like I'm going to be made of use again," I thought, though I then wondered a little bit about the request. Curiously, I stated, "I would think that after all that you have told me, you would try to garner any remaining goodwill you could for Shaloran. Wouldn't any aid be better sent by an official Shaloran emissary?" Solemnly, the general responded, "It isn't so much that I wouldn't mind doing that, but it's too dangerous for any Shalor to be outside of Elvia right now. Before you arrived here in Elvia, several humans from the lands to the west descended on our borders in anger. Many of the Shaloran you have rescued from our outlying settlements fell prey not to the devastation of Spellblaze, but rather to the wrath of peasants and farmers from the Cornac lands." I could feel a great shift in his tone as he continued. "Then they approached us here in Elvia to do the same. Perhaps you saw some of the corpses as you entered through the shroud when you came in." For a moment, he said nothing, as the impact of everything stayed seeped into my mind. He continued again in a normal tone. "Of course, it isn't just a terse moment of anger that keeps me from sending an envoy out. Someone is stirring the people of other lands to action. I don't know who or what organization is doing so, but I fear greatly for what some of the humans yelled when they came." The general's eyes soon crossed with mine, the serious manner of them captivating me. Feeling compelling to ask, I said, "What did they yell?" In the same grave tone as before he stated, "They yelled that Shaloran will pay for the Spellblaze." A bit clueless, I said, "Why would you fear mere words stating their rightful anger at you?" To this I received the firm answer, "Because none but few would have known that we called our grand plan to Spellblaze. To the various leaders of the races, and even to your king and queen, we only mentioned that we would be using Chateau ruins for a grand feat in magic. Someone told those human commoners that we were responsible, but it slipped up. I can tell some sort of clandestine operation is underway against my people." For a moment I stayed silent, before finally rising from my seat. Making a decision, I stated firmly, "Then I will run your aid supplies for you. What would you have me do?" Relaxing to this, the general promptly answered back to me, "As I'm sure you are aware, a Shaloran doesn't really make use of infusions, or any other natural remedy for that matter. We do have quite a bit of ingredients stored up though, and they could be used to help elsewhere. I'll procure a special chest that can be used to store all the ingredients that can be spared, and have you deliver it to a nearby Nargle kingdom. Right now, many refugees from near races are pouring into their capital, and likely they don't have ingredients to make all the infusions they will need." Nodding to this, I was motioned that I was ready to leave, but the general held up his hand and motioned for me to stop. He proceeded to make his way over to the table where he was first positioned in the room when I came in. Looking at me before turning to pick up some things, the Shalor approached and pressed the rune firmly into the palm of my hand, causing a pinkish glow to emit before stating, "You can use this rune in return to re-enter Elvia from whatever you may be. Know that you will be welcome to do so at any time." Giving a nod, the general also handed me a requisition order, allowing me to pick up some traveling gear from his rangers for my travels. When I was ready the next day, after having met with the ranger's corps master, I headed towards the city gates, where I was met one last time by the general. Accompanied by a small cadre of mages, as well as an assortment of well-armed and armored bodyguards. As I approached them, the general stated that the mages would teleport me to a location close to the Halfling city. He then handed me a small and nearly weightless chest, and some papers with an official Shaloran insignia on them. While I realized that the papers were likely a diplomatic message, I eagerly wondered what the purpose of the chest was, or where the infusion ingredients I had been tasked to deliver were at. When asked of this, one of the mages approached to take the chest from me, and demonstrating its use and purpose, pulled out 7 ingredients for a fusion store within. Seemingly more than could possibly fit within the chest itself. Taking back the chest that when I was refilled, I was then told by the general that when I reached the gates to the Nargol Kingdom, that all I should have to do is present the papers, and Nargol guards would take the chest. I would likely be allowed inside their capital, and could buy in additional new supplies I might need from there. After saying this, the general then handed me a pouched coin for that very purpose. Thanking the general, I was then escorted to a small circle in which runic design had been marked. The mages began to chant and wave their hands. My vision blurred as the surroundings around me began to dance. Then I saw dead trees and a nearby river covered black come into focus as the images of Elvia faded away. As my vision recovered, I could hear the sounds of a new location I found myself in. I stepped out into a clearing, looking down on a blasted hillside. As I looked around to get my bearings, I could see movement of a great many dwarves, humans, and halflings streaming toward the ruined gates of a great city, of which I soon be the capital of the Nargol Kingdom. Putting the chest in my pack, I began to make my way toward the road leading to the gates as well. I did not know this, but what I thought would be a brief stop on my way back to my home forest would soon herald the start of another adventure for me. I would find atrocities within the home of the Nargals that would only be dwarfed by the devastation caused by the Spellblaze. Such were the early events of what would soon be called the Spell Hunt, which even now spreads over the face of Maj'Eyal and threatens to throw all its races into ever closer oblivion. Alright, so basically, like, this is like sort of like, foreshadowing what's basically coming in book 2, by the way, because, like, essentially it's talking about how, like, what's basically going on, like the Cornacs basically like attacked Elvia. They're basically stirred up by, like, the Ziggurat to basically, attack the, like, Elvia, as opposed to, like, knowing basically, like, what was basically going on. So, I'll note that basically, like, just to throw it out there, book 1 here basically, like, talks about, like, the journey of, like, Fay. She basically walks down towards, like, Elvia, and basically, like, her, like, actions basically therein. But, as we basically go forward, we'll basically get to different books, and book 2 basically, like, sort of describes, like, the sort of, like, atrocities of the spell hunt, so to speak. And, like, book 3 as well, but, I'll note basically, like, something to note here. I actually, like, mentioned to Dark God that, like, I actually want to have, like, this book basically split, like, these, like, these books split up between, like, both Elvia and, like, the Ziggurat Library, just for a simple reason that because, like, the books, like, are so, like, intertwined, like, what the spell hunt was basically about, and because, like, it describes it in a very, like, negative light, it'd be better if it was basically in Ziggurat where, like, it'd be, like, left away from prying, like, eyes, so to speak. So, basically the idea here, like, of, like, these books here, some of these books are basically stolen from, like, basically, like, the Elvia, like, shady library here, and they're actually taken back to Ziggurat for, like, safekeeping, like, what, what my idea basically is for, like, this lore here. But, anyhow, that's basically it for book 1. And there's actually 5 books, so I'm actually not sure where we'll basically find a 5th book, but, we know where we're basically to find, like, the first 4, so there's that. And now, I'll need to basically earn about, like, 600 gold here to, like, show off, like, the next one, but, there's, like, book 2. And by the way, this is, like, one of the good things about, like, the lore I basically wrote, because it's actually in the Ziggurat library here, now this, like, library actually has, like, some, like, lore you can actually read here, so it's not just, like, a single book, there's, like, a whole lot of it. So, that's, like, one good thing about, like, my lore here, it actually fills up this, like, library here a little bit as well. Alright, so, I'm not sure what I'll be basically doing next, but, I'll probably return to, like, the Samurai Tunnel space to keep going. Zero over here. And let's just, like, change this to be, like, 25 maybe? Alright, well, I hope you guys basically enjoyed that. It only took me an hour to go through the first book there, but it's fine. And take care.